established lives beyond civilization. Eerie.
Hello, everyone. We are Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast, and I'm Steve.
I'm Marlo.
And we're joined today by author, mythnogeographist Phil Smith, here to talk about his latest book, Albion's Eco-Eerie. And in this episode, we are going to focus on Nigel Kneale and his Quatermass series, of which he wrote a lot about in Albion's Eco-Eerie, and we'll get into that discussion. But Phil Smith, who is he? He is known for his work in mythnogeography, which is a play off of psychogeography. He has the book The Pattern in 2020. His most recent book before Albion's Eco-Eerie is Goblin Queens and Qualia Knights, which here it says repurposes the codes of chivalry and courtly love in an existential crisis. He's also one half of Crab and Bee with Helen Billinghurst, a visual artist, and deals with a lot of walking projects. And so, Phil Smith, thank you for being here.
Hi, Marlo. Hi, Stephen. I like the way you're channeling a sort of Fritz Lang lighting effect there.
I was going to say the same thing, actually. It's also very Southern Gothic. I think the lighting pattern created by the Venetian blinds recalls a lot of Tennessee Williams.
Yeah, there's a touch of the Beguiled in there.
For those of you not watching this on YouTube, my hair is dazzled right now by sunlight. So, yeah, thanks again for coming on. And I think the first question, which is the question that I ask all of our interviewees, is how did you find out about Mark Fisher? What was your first introduction to him? And what has he meant for you?
Goodness, that's actually quite difficult to answer. I'm trying to now think when I first heard of Mark Fisher and Mark Fisher's work. And I'm struggling, actually, Stephen, to answer that. I've certainly known of the work for at least, I would say, 15 years. And I think probably originally, but I'm guessing now, but originally probably came across like quotations, references to it in other literature. That's my guess. And I think probably around the sort of kind of hauntological, the people talking perhaps online or in magazines or whatever around this kind of haunted generation, 70s TV, some of the folk horror stuff. And I think I probably read the name there and saw references to the weird and the eerie and eventually thought I'm going to have to get this book and read it and would have done that. So I probably first read the book, I don't know, maybe 10 to 12 years ago.
Weird and Eerie?
Yeah, is that possible? Or was it published by then? I think, no, it's 2016 it's published, isn't it? Yeah. So I must have read it fairly soon after it was published, I think.
Did you ever get a chance to meet him, or did you know people who were friends with him?
No, sadly not. No. I mean, I've listened and watched a number of his recorded lectures online, but no. But I certainly was well aware of him and had read a lot of his work by the time that he died.
Yeah. Weird and the Eerie is the book that this season is based on, and we're going through every chapter of it to give a breakdown of it. And the chapter that this is going to come out with is Eerie Thanatos, Nigel Kneale, and Alan Gardner. But first, what drew you to The Weird and the Eerie, the book? Like you said, you really gravitated towards that book, but what about that book in particular? Most people, I think, go to capitalist realism or Ghosts of My Life, or they're K-punk fans, but I think Weird and the Eerie is that like secret one that people don't all know about.
Yeah, maybe I didn't come through being aware of Mark Fisher's work, his online work and his K-punk stuff. I wasn't aware of that. As I say, I suppose to wind the tape a little bit further back, just before the millennium, I sort of had this kind of shift in what I was doing. So I was sort of working in small-scale theatre as a writer of that, and just prior to the millennium, got into making site-specific performance. So this much closer address to place rather than creating narratives or fictions for theatre spaces. And out of that came this kind of walking obsession, again, continuing with a very close attention to the kind of places, particularly sort of marginal spaces, edgelands, derelict spaces, post-industrial spaces, that kind of thing. And as well as actually being there, I sort of got interested again in where those landscapes turn up in fiction and in movies and TV. And I was already sort of into those spaces in the sense of being deeply affected by them really from childhood. In the early episodes of Doctor Who, for example, there's a very early serial where I think it's the second of the Dalek serial, and it's basically, I think it's called Dalek's Invasion of Earth or something like that. It all takes place in this kind of derelict London. I mean, they were affected by the Blitz. They experienced, many of these writers were very influenced by childhood or teenage experiences of growing up under German bombing and seeing the possibility of the entire ruin of cities. So, I was absolutely terrified by this. I think it's the very first thing that happens is that the sort of the camera kind of pans in on a sign that says something like dumping of corpses in the river is banned, something like that. And then the next thing you see is this robo man who's kind of who's suffering some kind of breakdown. He's got this kind of prosthesis that the Daleks have put on his head and just kind of throws himself in the river. And I mean, the idea that you could have a prosthesis attached to you that would make you destroy yourself, to my sort of, I don't know what, 8 or 9-year-old self, was absolutely terrifying. I mean, the sign was bad enough, but to see this happening, I was absolutely shocked. And then the Dalek then sort of perversely appears out of the water at the end of that episode. I mean, I didn't, the thought that Daleks could get underwater, I mean, it's bad enough, the idea of Daleks at all. But the idea that they would be underwater, that was completely shocking. But at the same time, when I would go into those types of environments, into kind of ruined spaces, or I would travel in to London as a teenager on the train, and I'd see these. There were sometimes there were bomb sites, sometimes they were just kind of post-industrial sites. I felt they had a real magic to them, that there was something about them where maybe things were more possible than perhaps in the usual kind of suburban shopping centre or residential district. There was something about those spaces that you felt you might meet a time traveling alien there. That there was something about the possibility of them, the affordance of those spaces. So I think that's how I came to want to read a book called Weird and Eerie, and was delighted once I got inside the book to find that so many of the references were to artifacts that I'd already encountered and therefore meant a lot to me. Not all of it, I must admit. There are definitely sort of blank spaces for me in that book. I've never been able to get into the work of Alan Garner, who I know lots of people who like the stuff I like really like Alan Garner, and for some reason I've never been able to connect to his fictions and to the programs that are based on his work. But much of that stuff I was familiar with. Lovecraft I've been reading for, I don't know, 25 years or something. So there was a lot of resonance for me in it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It lines up to a conversation me and Steve were having. I guess the only thing that can remotely approach something like the London bombing in our lifetime is just the COVID lockdowns and all of that, where you just do see this sort of edge of society's mortality. And from that, you do get this notion of, oh, there's other possibilities. So yeah, that whole idea of these spaces that still had the scars of the bombings and all that growing up.
We're getting into the eerie, and one thing that I'm noticing about the whole section is it seems like so much of the work that we're reading and watching, including Quatermass, is dealing with the fallout of the London bombings. I'm reading The Birds at the moment when we're recording, and in that, it's very much a recurring London bombing by the Birds. And she makes it very clear that they're having memories of the bombing, or they're using the same bunkers as they did when the bombing happened, and then you get into the Quatermass, and like we'll get into it in a little bit, but Quatermass in the Pit is also remnants or the traces of the London bombing. And yeah, you can sort of see this as like almost an unconscious psyche that guides the eeriness that haunts the latter half of the 20th century London.
Absolutely. So I think that's part of the power of many of these artifacts, is that they reference a historical reality as well as a fantasy. There's something rooted in people's memories of real experiences. I mean, I grew up in Coventry, which, although the bombing there is not comparable, say, to the suffering experience in the Japanese cities or in German cities like Dresden, it still was pretty intense for the people who were experiencing it. And there was one night in Coventry when I think just under 400 people died, and the centre of the city, which was medieval, was burnt to the ground. I mean, a lot of it was wooden based. The cathedral went. So it was pretty extraordinary. My grandfather was on air raid warden duty that night, and he has this horrible story, which he didn't tell me, but apparently where my grandparents lived, which was above a shop, there was a pub opposite, and my granddad saw a tramp, a homeless guy, which was a rare thing, much rarer at that time than it is now, where it's ubiquitous. Saw this tramp outside the pub, wandering around the pub, and knew that the husband, there was a single woman living in the pub. The husband was fighting abroad, and my grandfather went over and told this guy to clear off and go up the road. And about 20 minutes later, up the road just went up with a whole string of bombs. And I know my grandfather feared that he'd unintentionally sent this man to his death. So, one was aware of that. I used to play in a back garden, and I think at that house, and my grandparents thought that 7 incendiary bombs had dropped one night onto the garden, onto the house, and they only ever found 6 of them. So there was always this sense that there was this lurking threat. I actually turned up, not a German bomb, but actually an anti-aircraft shell, unexploded, with a friend of mine. We dug it up on a building site and took it home and showed it to
Wow.
well, he took it from my friend's father, who'd been a rear gunner on these Wellington bombers, and he kind of like nearly passed out on the spot and said, "You've got to take it back," which is interesting. God, else to take it back. I mean, it wasn't
rebury it.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't going to go off because we'd already tried to make it go off by throwing it at a electricity substation wall for 20 minutes, So that was probably a bit of it. Anyway, the bomb squad came and took it away. But so that reality was hanging around. But those spaces didn't just hold the feeling of threat. There was also, in those sort of liminal spaces, building sites, old derelict sites, there was a feeling that there was not just a ghost of the past, but also a ghost of the future. That time would get slippery in those spaces. And when I came to read The the weird and the eerie, that a lot of the things that I just felt as a teenager and subsequently, a lot of those things came back to me, in a theoretical form.
You have this wonderful passage in your section of Quatermass Experiment where you talk about breaking in one night as a teenager to Coombe Abbey Park. And I think one of the reasons why the people that are drawn to this book is because they have similar experiences that you'd had. I've said this story before, but I broke into a derelict, abandoned hospital as a teenager. And we would go and they had everything still set up like it. Part of it was a mental hospital, part of it was a rehab center. And they had everyone's records there of people who had stayed. And you could see when people would try to escape. And you had the wheelchairs and the like Polaroid pictures that were left on the ground because it was abandoned, because it was ready to be condemned and turned into suburban housing, which it is now. And you even mentioned that in that little bit about the architecture at odds with the mass-produced suburban homes we all came from. And this hospital that I used to break into as a teenager is now turned into these cul-de-sacs of suburban houses.
It's very common in the UK. Old psychiatric hospitals are now kind of bijou residences. The only bit of the whole kind of complex that hasn't are the two little morgues. There was a male and a female morgue, and no one's quite got it together to kind of take possession of those. But everywhere else is very smart and quite expensive flats. Yeah, that's quite common now. But the past is eradicated there. It's called, I can't remember, but there's no reference to the former name. There's no reference to a hospital. It's quite sort of straight, and that generally is the case, that it's that is kind of hidden away. I mean, it's not like a secret. I mean, people must know, but there's no kind of acknowledgement or celebration. I mean, a long time ago now, I was asked along with a number of artists to participate in a celebration, really, of the closing of one of those hospitals, and worked a lot of time talking to clients who were there at the time, former clients, former staff, and visitors, and so on, and built up a kind of oral picture of the place. And I can remember a woman saying to me, a former patient, because it was often they were quite big, imposing buildings, and a lot of people would have thought of them as frightening, quite gothic. But she said that the moment, when she was sectioned, the moment that she came through those big sort of pillars at the gate and drove up and saw this big building, she said the feeling of relief was enormous, that the sense of, here was an organization that where they were going to do something for her, they were going to actually pay attention and give her some care. So there's a lot in those places to be celebrated. I know that in some of them there were some very bad things went on, but also there were some very good things. And so it's important to kind of, I think, to acknowledge that kind of reality. At the time I spent as this hospital was being closed down, so not all of it, a lot of it was empty. I was there by invitation, I hadn't sneaked in like yourself. You could actually walk around the corridors the whole way around and doing a circuit, and this isn't in the middle of the night, and coming around a corner, and one of the other artists was on the other side, and I'm jumping out my skin because I hadn't expected to see him quite close. And he gave me such a telling off. His mum had been sectioned and admitted in the past, and he said, "What? You're just wandering around in a bloody horror movie. You're not seeing what's here, And that is true. I do walk around with all this, as we all probably do, with all these sort of media assumptions. That was a particularly banal and stupid one. But I think sometimes one can use these more subtle media artifacts in one's exploration of real places in a way that's not just about, the bogeyman. It's not just about fear. It's not about malign forces that are out to get you, but something much more numinous, much more subtle, much more dynamic, I think.
Yeah, so I guess just starting off on the introduction, you kind of lay out this lovely titled idea of hobgoblinology, which you contrast to hauntology, and you relate it kind of contrasting almost with folk horror. And I'm just curious if you want to expand on like that little triune and how they interrelate to each other.
So the kind of contesting hauntology with this idea of hobgoblinology. My starting point is the first English translation of Karl Marx's and Friedrich Engels's Communist Manifesto, where I think the translator was a woman called Helen Macfarlane, and rather than saying there's a spectre haunting Europe and it is communism, translated as that there is a frightful hobgoblin haunting Europe and it is communism. And this was later on sort of corrected to spectre, which is probably a more accurate translation of the German. But I've always rather liked hobgoblin. And if you look at the kind of history of the revolutionary movement and this great, this socialist, communist sort of movement, working class movement that emerges, this coherent industrial class emerging in the 19th century, and the way that quite late on in its development, these revolutionary parties arise as a kind of leadership of that class, that those parties are very often made up of, or at least run and led by, intellectuals rather than the working class who are making up the rank and file of that movement. The trade unions are very often led by workers or at least officials who've come out of many years' experience of work. And I suppose part of what's nagging away at me is this sense that the hobgoblins were excluded from or were not given the leading role in that, and that it's the spectres, the intellectuals, the ideas that begin to guide that movement much less than the messy masses. So that's part of where that's coming from. The other sense is who the hobgoblins actually are, or what the hobgoblins actually are. And this comes out of a lot to do with my own wandering around, partly on my own, partly in this work together that I do in Crab and Bee with my colleague Helen Billinghurst. And I spend a lot of time, or have spent a lot of time, not so much by choosing as much as just simply where one is finding oneself. Spend a lot of time around the former mine works that are around, particularly where I now live, tin mines, silver mines, arsenic mines, and starting to feel a sensitivity towards what one might call a goblin presence there. In Cornwall, which is just across the river from me, the tin mines are all closed now, but the tin miners had a long-standing tradition of what they called knockers, who were these figures that never really quite appeared, but would knock on the walls of the mines to warn the miners that there was a likely fall and to warn them of the danger. Miners famously would leave food for the knockers, which would always disappear, probably because the rats there ate it. And to follow up David Abrams' famous comment about, you would say, well, the rats are the goblins, they're part of the whole goblin thing. The goblin is partly the worker, partly the miner, or the metalsmith or whatever, but is also partly the thing being mined. So that knocking, it's the mine shifting. I had a friend who was Welsh coal miner, and he would say that it was, the pit would start to talk to you. It would, if the face was moving, it would actually make a sound which would warn you that large amounts of geology were shifting. So it would kind of talk to you. And so I think the goblin is both the miner themselves, but it's also the thing being mined. So it's, in a way, the goblin connects together both the human labor, but also the natural resource that is being labored upon. And it's that fusion. So there's a sort of Marxist basis to this idea, or at least a class basis to this idea. And then once you've got that idea, then you can start to see a lot of these artifacts in a slightly different way, a little bit less spectral, a little bit less ghostly and less haunting, and more to do with the mushiness, the messiness, the gooiness. I think that's why I like a lot of M.R. James's stories, because his ghosts are not these diaphanous figures sort of flitting around, but are made of kind of gooiness and are made of the things themselves. I think I point out in the book that, spoiler alert, that the film's Warning to the Curious and Whistle and I'll Come to You.
The chapter before Nigel Neal's, which this will come after, is on A Whistle and I'll Come to You.
Okay. In which case, I won't go there in great detail, but it's the things, I think, that in those stories that are haunting, not a spectral ghost. It's objects, or more importantly, it's places, I think. For me, the problem with the hauntological is, well, I mean, if we go back to Derrida, he kind of takes this idea of spectre and expands upon it in a bit of a sort of Baudrillardian way, where we're kind of living in this spectral miasma. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think we're living in a sort of spectacle post-spectacle. I don't dispute that, but as a means to kind of then get inside it, to kind of to pierce it or to work in it, I think it helps to make an ally with the hobgoblin, rather than with the ghosts, rather than with the spectres. Sorry, that was a bit convoluted response.
No, and I think you mentioned it very briefly in the introduction, but I thought it was rather enlightening to go in and actually listen to it. The speech by Melville in regards to the octopus and the coconut shells, and this whole idea of Gothic Marxism and Marxism looking to folk production of folk mythology and stuff, and also sort of a Marxism that celebrates the monsters, I think is the terms that China Melville put it in. I thought was a pretty good background to have for reading the other parts of your book that I read.
Yeah, I very much am indebted to Derrida, and I got to Mark Fisher through Derrida, which is a different route than most people take, I think. But for Derrida, I always thought of it as his whole project is very much almost a material of the haunting. Like he's trying to figure out the way in which the haunting of our social fabric, it can be explained materially, and what kind of messiness that comes about when you have signifiers that don't line up with what they're assigned to. And that, I think, is something that I related to initially when reading Derrida. And I think a lot of people misunderstand it as a sort of idealistic framework, whereas I've always been like, no, similar to like Baudrillard making sense of the material of simulation. I think Derrida makes sense of the material of being in a lot of ways, or the haunting that being assumes someone's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, a really good example of that is in Quatermass and the Pit, the film, where they sort of go across away from the underground station where the spaceship and everything has been found. They cross the street and they go into these deserted cottages with the policeman, with the I can't remember whether he's a sergeant, but he's a sort of street copper, and they go in there with him, and nothing very much happens. I mean, they pay attention to some scratches on the walls, and then they just get completely freaked out. And the policeman he's sweating profusely. And he sort of eventually has to sort of run out to get out of it and disappears up the road. I thought that's a fantastic moment, and it's the place itself. There's no spook appears, and yet the policeman is completely spooked by it. And later on, you sort of get to find out that this was actually, prior to these cottages being built, this was a place where goblins were seen, where there were charcoal burners digging up the trees, burning the trees, disturbing the ground. The kind of implication is that some resonance of this fallen spaceship was being communicated. But at the same time, we're back with the miners, we're back with the goblins, we're back with the workers, with the charcoal burners. And the charcoal burners are making charcoal in order to create great heat, in order to be used to fuel forges and whatever. So we're in a very industrial, if medieval context. And that's freaking out the policeman, So something is getting to him, which is the alien quality of that collective work. It's the residue of labor which is spooking out the characters, and therefore it's not portrayed as a demon or at least not as a ghost. I think that's kind of there's a weakness, I think, at the end of the film where this kind of giant vision of a Martian appears and they get this crane to crash into it, and somehow that kind of earths it and destroys. Or I think it's an old idea, of iron being used against the fairy sort of thing. But the vision of it is, this idea of it's a devil, it's a demon. I think that's much less interesting than what goes on in a much less melodramatic way inside those cottages. When I first saw it, which was quite a long time ago now, that's what I took away from that movie, was just how terrifying it was inside those cottages, and yet nothing is happening. I mean, there's very little happening, and I think it's where the kind of movie kind of accidentally speaks what's really going on. So I think somewhere in the book I make this point, that a bit like 19th century symphonies, that they're just trying to get the whole thing together, all the training, the management, the money, the buildings that are necessary to get a symphony orchestra there and playing a symphony is so massive that so many different forces involved. And it's the same with feature films, that there are so many different forces involved that almost inevitably movies blurt out these things that that nobody involved particularly wanted to say or wanted to portray. And yet, because of that, I would call it random complexity. There's so much involved, but it's of a sort of random nature, but it is complex, it is organized, because of there are these tendencies to blurt out these revelatory moments. And for me, that's one of them.
I love that moment in the film, and it's really an eerie moment, and it's what Fisher calls in his definition of eerie, it's the failure of presence, because there's nothing there and you're expecting something to be there, or it's like that tension in between.
It's the two things together. Yeah.
You're not sure what is behind this and what that thing wants. Yeah, Quatermass in the Pit kind of is, in many ways, it's a Lovecraft story. It's, you're finding this ancient truth about the genealogy of man. A lot of the action is just characters kind of going insane. So yeah, it's one I definitely, and I agree with you. The ending, it almost reminded me of the ending of the first Ghostbusters movie, where suddenly there's this big thing in the sky, and they have to, cross streams or whatever.
Yeah.
Now that we're talking about the movies, I wanted to quote Fisher from The Weird and the Eerie, when I think he gives a good summarization of the first three. So the distinction between alien and human is fatally unsettled. As the Quatermass sequence progresses, the alien has become increasingly intimate. In the first installment, the Quatermass Experiment, the aliens are out in space. In the second, Quatermass 2, the aliens are already amongst us. And in the third, Quatermass in the Pit, we are the aliens.
Yeah, it's a little bit schematic, because I think in the first one, Victor Caroon becomes alien. I mean, he presumably arrives alien, and the alien side of him develops.
And you love his character, as you made clear in your chapter on it. You felt almost terrified the first time, and then you came to love the character almost. And I wondered about.
I think that's right. I think I really didn't like. there was something about that character that I definitely found very disturbing. And I think I could probably put my finger on it now, which is that the character almost never speaks. I think Victor Carroon says two words. I think he says, "Help me," and that's it. And I think it's silence and reading in just the mystery of what is going on inside this person as they turn very gradually, it doesn't happen suddenly, from a human being into a plant, into a sort of vegetal being. And that's a pretty extraordinary process. And it's done quite subtly. And the moment when at one point he reveals his hand, which he's been hiding, and it's kind of turned into a cactus.
Huge.
Yeah, huge cactus, which is kind of like terrifying in a sense. It is terrifying. I mean, the idea, just the idea of having these thorns, these spikes growing out of your hand, which means that in order to touch anything, you're going to harm that thing that you touch. So that's a completely different dynamic to the usual human dynamic. And I mean, in a sense, it's a bit crude in that it's a threatening thing, but I mean, it's just triggering in one's head all sorts of other things that a plant would do differently to a human, or that a human plant would do differently from a human. And so I think in broad terms, yes, Fisher's right in that development, but actually that development to us being the aliens is actually right there. It's just that it's all encapsulated in one character. And then there's that, again, the films don't have great endings, do they? So in the way that Quatermass and the Pit ends up with the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man equivalent, the same thing happens in the first one, where Victor Carroon turns into, I mean, I thought it was an octopus. I mean, when you look more carefully, it is supposed to be some sort of giant plant. The first time I saw it, which was a very long time ago, I think I just assumed it was some sort of tentacular, octopus creature.
The close-ups to the face definitely have a very 20,000 Leagues Kraken look to it, I would say. Yeah, I agree with you there.
Which I think is terrible, because I mean it's laughable, and but at least if they'd gone for something more obviously plant-like, it would have been laughable and weird. At the moment, I think it's just laughable. The only way they get away with it, and it is rather effective, is that you only really see it, or most of the time you see it on a television screen, on a monitor, and that helps enormously. But I think it's a distraction from this important vegetable content to the movie, and so it sort of throws you, as you say, like 20,000, one of these giant octopi kind of jumping out of the sea or attacking a submarine or whatever. Yeah,
they needed the makeup artist from Troll 2 to help them out there.
Yeah.
You seem to link the first one especially, and I found this very astute, is the spectacle. And you seem to be referencing Guy Dubois' Society of the Spectacle. And I know him also as through psychogeography. And it seems like there is this link that you make between the spectacle and also in this movie, this re-enchantment, I guess, or this enchantment of the society, especially in the zoo scene. And I think it works with your argument about the Eco-Albion as being sort of re-enchanting the land through these kind of movies.
Yeah. I think part of the reason that I love Victor Carroon as a character now is that he does turn into a bit of a vegetable derivist. Once he takes on this plant nature, he starts to kind of, once he escapes from the hospital, he's just wandering sort of rather aimlessly around in London, and he's exploring some really fascinating sort of alleyways, docklands, and so on. And that allows the movie itself then to enjoy and luxuriate in those spaces. So at the very early on in the movie, this spaceship crashes, and within seconds, the powers that be have turned it into a spectacle. They've got it floodlit. They've got, although they're saying everybody must go home, they've actually got the whole thing ringed off at like a sort of amphitheater. And, it's very much a spectacle. The first thing that Quatermass does on arriving at the site is not to look at the site, but to immediately demand to speak to the press. Well, what has he got to say about, doesn't he know?
Which is him in every movie. He always seems to want to go to the press as much and as quickly as possible, despite everyone else's protestations about that.
Yeah. He's in that sense, he's a very modern of that period. He's a very modern scientist in that he sees himself as a public intellectual in that way. Who's media savvy, who knows the kind. In every case, the media really loves. Quatermass and the Pit. Within 2 minutes, they've got newspaper vans shooting around with 8 Man Discovered or whatever it is on the side. Very quickly it goes from a little tiny dig inside a tube station to this, national media headlines. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a really important sort of thing. You also see the nervousness in the authorities about what to let people know. That which is definitely a sort of wartime habit. It's sort of like, or what's our cover story? What can we put out about this?
One of the most striking moments as I was reading your essay and watching the movie and linking it to the Society of the Spectacle, there's this great moment where Victor Carroon is in the hospital, and I think it's one of the doctors or one comes in and says, "You're our star patient." He kind of treats him as a celebrity, and in Society of the Spectacle, there's a very really insightful moment where he talks about the role of celebrity. And to me, Victor Carroon becomes this corrupted celebrity figure for the movie, and his wanderings and he in his final transformation is this kind of like the horror of being a celebrity patient.
Which happens on television.
Which happens on television at the Battersea. And so there's this iconicness to both the setting and also the filming of the setting.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that through line, but I think you're absolutely right that the moment that the doctor says you're the star patient, he's going to end up on national television as a monster hanging off a bit of scaffold in wherever they are, Westminster Abbey, I think they're supposed to be.
I wouldn't have thought of it without also having read your book about it. So
yeah. I mean, I think I doubt if that's in the mind of the Nigel Neal. It might be a little very subtle little hint of what's to come, but I think if it's not, it's definitely what I was talking about earlier, where the movie blurts out what it's really about. It can't help itself but do that. You mentioned I kind of railroaded all over you that mentioned the scene in the zoo.
Yes.
What was it that got you about that?
Well, you paired it with when you were going in as a teenager, and that scene reminded you of the eerie spaces of going into the Coombe Abbey Park. It's relatable in the same way breaking into the hospital for me, and how Victor Carroon, there's this horror that he, as you said, like with his hand, he murders anything that's around him, but also that as soon as the caretaker leaves, the place comes to life with it. And I think you mentioned that in your essay. It makes me think of Kafka with his character of the hunger artist and how he's kept in a cage. And this guy, Victor Carroon, is also in his own cage and animalized in this way, where he takes the energy of the animal and becomes the animal himself.
Yeah, there's a sort of question there, isn't there? Is to what extent is Karun murdering the animals, and to what extent is there an energy exchange going on, or a hybridization? If they'd had the resources, would it have turned into a version of John Carpenter's The Thing? Would you begin to see the leopards and whatever that are drained by Karun in the zoo? Would they start to appear manifest as parts of the Karun plant monster? I don't know. There is something extraordinary in that sequence, partly in the way that the point of view shifts, that you're actually given Victor's point of view at one point coming through the bush, so again it's preempting that idea that we are the Martian, and I think that's actually more effective because it's actually in the cinematic language, whereas I think in Quatermass and the Pit, maybe you can correct me, but I can't think of anywhere in that movie where we're given the point of view of the alien. I don't. Maybe when we're
dream sequence a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah, maybe. But it's so unconvincing, that dream vision thing. It it doesn't really have the impact that it could do. Because it's so sort of, they're so obviously sort of models being shifted around. It doesn't look like, I know it's supposed to be some terrible cull, but it actually looks like people queuing up to go somewhere, and there's a few flashes, and that's about, it's certainly not horrific, and it feels unreal in the worst possible sense. It just looks fake.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, the point of view of Victor Karun coming through the bush, emerging from the bush, and that viewpoint, and then the cages and the animals opening up, I think there's much more a sense for the cinema viewer of, I'm alien now. I'm coming through this vegetation, which I'm partly vegetation, and I'm seeing my lunch, which is these predators. That's now everything's going very blurry for me as to who I am and what I could possibly be. So I think in a weird way, maybe Mark Fisher's got it the wrong way around. Sense, maybe it goes the other way. But I can see formally, narrative-wise, is absolutely right. But something's happening in the texture, which is entangling the different aspects, I think. Yeah. We haven't talked that much about Quatermass 2, which is my favorite.
I was going to talk about Brian Donlevy next and his portrayal of Quatermass as a way to talk about Quatermass 2 also, because for our listeners, Brian Donlevy is an Irish-American actor who's in England as Quatermass for some reason, we don't know, heading this rocket program. And I think in both Quatermass and Quatermass 2, he puts on quite a performance.
Yeah, he does not try to be English at all. If anything, does the exact opposite and tries to be Humphrey Bogart. I say it reminds me of a Saturday Night Live sketch where they'll do the Lord of the Rings, but they'll have whatever celebrity athlete guest on as the Gandalf, and there's just the Lord of the Rings, and then, Charles Barkley as Gandalf sticking out there. It's fun in some ways, but it's definitely a noticeable contrast, I'll say.
Watching it as an English person and seeing this, I'm just assuming it's an American character because of the accent, rather than an American actor pretending to be a British character, which I never got any sense of. In many ways, it kind of explains the extraordinary nature of that character and the way people respond to him as unorthodox. He's definitely portrayed as and reacted to as if there's something very unusual. He bursts into rooms where he should really be knocking at the door and asking permission to come in. He wants to take action, and he's demanding to be taken seriously in a way that in terms of 1950s, early 1960s kind of protocols, he definitely seems to be breaking some rules there. Not, big rules, but just kind of etiquette stuff. And that makes a lot of sense, that this is someone who's operating slightly out of their cultural norms, and therefore are willing to be more kind of proactive and more kind of barrier breaking. My problem is that I saw the Quatermass movies, the first ones that I saw, I think I probably saw Quatermass 2 first, actually. So much liked it that the thought of anybody else playing Quatermass kind of, almost sort of rankled with me, because it was so much that portrayal that I was associating.
So he's
And
your canon Quatermass.
I equated the two. I equated him as Quatermass, really, I suppose. I didn't know his acting in other movies. I hadn't seen the recordings of or what remain of the recordings of the TV series up to that point. I think that certainly Andre Morel in one of those. And so I never had any sort of unease about that. This relationship between this British establishment, which is essentially an Anglo establishment, and this American outsider, it helps in a way to emphasize and to highlight what's going on. I mean, the military in Quatermass and the Pit end up concocting this Nazi UFO story to sort of not admit what's actually very obviously going on in front of them, and that sort of desperate denial of the weird reality that's in front of them, trying to sort of get it back into something they can get their hands onto, which is, let's fight the war we've just fought, sort of thing, rather than confront this actual future. I think he exposes those conservative forces. And then in Quatermass 2, it's the way that he loses control, which I think is really interesting. That in Quatermass 2, he's the proactive one. He's the one who's crashing into the so-called community centre and disturbing everything and challenging the workforce there to actually address what's really happening in the plant. But then he loses control of it. Then that workforce takes over and starts marching as on the plant itself, and Quatermass is sort of left in their wake. I mean, he's part of that movement, but he is an outsider in that sense. So he's a good ally to them, but he's not the leader. And I think that's powerful. I think that's a really interesting development. That's why I think I like Quatermass 2 most, because you see the goblins, you see the workforce becoming collective and acting and willing to do things that will not serve their immediate purpose. They're willing to make sacrifices in order to achieve something further down the line, not necessarily for themselves as individuals, but for that entire community. And the intellectual leader, the scientist, is not in the leadership of it. It's now being led by, Irish labourers who are marching up. They're the ones that are now calling the tune. And there's much more of a collective sense. And that is then set off against these huge vegetable monsters that are erupting out of these domes. It's wonderfully ambiguous as to whether it's the id of the vegetables which is erupting inside the workforce, or whether it's the id of the workforce that's erupting inside of the vegetable domes. There's a very clear kind of interaction, if not a kind of mirroring effect going on there. And I think that's why I like it. And I think Don Levy plays that part really, really well. He's initially this irritant in the system, prodding it, asking difficult questions. But when it comes to it, he sort of ends up as a foot soldier, rather than trying to be, Vladimir Lenin. He's not sort of getting up there and making the big speech. He's in there with everybody else, sort of manning the barricade, so to speak. So I know that there's a lot of, and I know that Val Guest, the director, said a lot of things about Don Levy being drunk on set. Well, I mean, if he was, I can't. Can you see him? He doesn't appear to me to be drunk.
Yeah. He has a certain energy that I think he's a very functional individual, but he definitely has a certain I think honestly, if anything, it helps them out a little bit. My other question, you identify a certain anti-collectivism in Quatermass and set against, British post-war, I was recently just kind of offhandedly reading some stuff about how the rationing went on like for years after the war. And a lot of these structures of a wartime society petered and on the one hand gave you guys a national health service, but these movies are set against these. They're portrayed as the bad guys, but they're not necessarily wrong. As you point out, Quatermass is just running this rocket program, but it's unclear what the structures of oversight are. He apparently launched a nuke into space for fun. Which again, I brought up Ghostbusters earlier, but that kind of reminds me of a common critique of those movies about how the EPA bureaucrat is actually the good guy against these people irresponsibly running a nuclear reactor in the middle of Manhattan. But yeah, if you could just speak to the way these films deal with collectivism in that question.
And this very much brings us back to Mark Fisher, I think, because what he's writing about, in a way, he's writing about it more in capitalist realism than he is in Weird and the Eerie, but it's in the context of this cancellation of the future. There's this sense that the utopian hope that was there in the 1945-51 Labour government immediately after the Second World War, in which there was nationalisation, there was a lot of investment in public services, and we still have at least a semblance of a national health service as a result of that. There was the sense by the 70s that was in crisis, that there were economic crises, but there was also the beginnings of a kind of neoliberal, well, I'm going to say opposition, but it's an opposition within the ruling class. And that's the propaganda that they were putting out was beginning to have some purchase on people. And partly because the bureaucracies that have been set up were only ever partially serving the people that they were supposed to be serving. So the National Health Service was probably the glowing example of where there really was true service to the users. But there were other nationalized industries and services that's where the bureaucracies seemed to be very impersonal, very sort of bossy, more operated in the interest of the bureaucrats themselves than the people that they were supposed to be serving. That's Adam Curtis's sort of analysis of where it goes wrong post-war. I don't think that was necessarily true of the National Health Service. I think it's true of certain sections of it now, where sections have been privatized and commercialized, but I'm not sure that was really very true in the 60s and 70s. But parts of that system were creaking. Partly they were creaking because of underinvestment. Already there was pressure to cut down on public funding. So that sense that things are going to be modern, things are going to be more and more democratic, things are going to be more and more egalitarian, there was a sense that was in trouble. And there was also this sense that anything that was state operated had a nasty sort of resonance with the state totalitarian structures of Nazi Germany and of the Soviet Union. And so there was this kind of suspicion of anything state run, anything that's becoming a sort of bureaucratic ruling class. And Nigel Neal is particularly sort of sensitive to that, I think. He's seeing sinister little burgeonings of that within otherwise relatively benign contexts. I think he's also quite conservative as an individual with a small c. I think he's also quite socially conservative. He's very good at latching on to the spectacle, to the dangers of popular commercial broadcasting and so on, and the way that national media or media with a national reach can manipulate people. But I think he's also disturbed by some of the the things that are, some of the personal liberation or aspects of personal liberation that are emerging in the 60s and early 70s, and I think you see that in the last of the Quatermass series, where there are these planet people who are sort of hippie-ish, post-punk kind of eco activist people, but who are totally naive. That they are as blind to what is obviously going on in front of them as the military are in Quatermass and the Pit. And so I think there's this kind of contradiction, I think, perhaps in Nigel Neal's approach, which is what makes him such a good writer, because we get this friction, we get this rubbing together of these different forces at work, that within these kind of benevolent state structures there are these worrying qualities, particularly around nuclear technology. That moment when in Quatermass 2, when they drive out of the
facility,
the experimental rocket facility, and they drive up, and there's this big sign that says, I think it says Carlisle by the side. I was always totally bemused as to why this arbitrary sign suddenly turns up. I think I'd always sort of imagined before I noticed that this was somewhere in Suffolk or East Anglia on the east coast of England, and now it's suddenly up north. Why is that there? And apparently it's because there was a nuclear missile development site just beyond Carlisle, and that this is a specific nod to that reality. So I think there's tension between a potentially benign state and a Cold War state, a state that is being constructed on the basis of global annihilation. And I think it's that tension which is so powerfully evident in what perhaps lots of people would see as a rather throwaway sort of sci-fi movie. But I think in many ways, though, those Quatermass movies were contending with that. And I mean, they had a huge impact. I mean, when these programs were shown on television, I mean, it had a national impact. It was people were going to work the next day, and it was the subject of conversation, undoubtedly, and it rattled the establishment. I mean, endless letters to the Times and Conservative MPs raising questions in the House of Commons about it. Should we be having this violent media on our TV sets? Definitely he was pushing towards unspeakable subjects at the time, I think.
I think there's something to go back to Quatermass being cast as an American that gets to the unspoken truth, because you're saying like there's all this accidental truth that's being told through these movies, and American partnership with stay behind missions in England was a reality, that they worked in partnership, that the British government worked in partnership with the American government to create the Cold War state. And on top of all that there was a shift to marketing British exports to America. I wrestle with this also. I wrote about Led Zeppelin in the Temporary Boundaries, where and that Led Zeppelin very much marketed itself as to Americans first before British. And I think that Brian Donlevy's casting was to, in very large part, appeal to an American mass audience. On top of
all this,
and it was also, they changed the name of it.
Enemy from Space, was it, or something?
Or
like
Beyond the Unknown, or Beyond the something. They changed large parts of it to basically have a wider audience, and they cast him instead of as an American to do this. And I think when we talk about the march to neoliberalism that comes in the future as sort of a specter that we know now all haunts this post-war period, that giant bureaucratic state apparatuses that were created after the war are eventually going to be sold off in piecemeal once neoliberalism is the modus operandus and doesn't present an alternative. The only action that you can take is to privatize different bits of the post-war state apparatuses. And I think there is some truth to casting him as an American, especially in Quatermass 2, when just the image of him going to the Irish laborers and saying, you need to revolt, like an American walking into an Irish bar and saying, I'm a scientist, I'm the Oppenheimer trying to blow up the world. And by the way, you should revolt against the people that that are over the hill, that are in this plant, that are paying you not enough wages, I think is his pitch to them, because they're making synthetic plants. It reminds me of this tension in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, where the MI6, the circus, is torn between aligning with Americans or keeping it the same as it was, this, small mom and pop British organization, versus globalizing to align with American interests. And there's that in Quatermass as well, that I think in retrospect is a precursor to the class structures and the state building that neoliberalism formulated. And my question then is, like, do you view Quatermass as the hero or villain of these movies?
That's a great question. I think he's one of the monsters, isn't he? I think that's what he is.
Well, I think he's one of the monsters in the first movie, but as you know, in the second movie, he kind of becomes an ally. So there's
the workforce is also a monster. It's a collective beast, and or can be. It can realize its power as such, and he becomes part of that. So he becomes part of that hybrid, along with the police chief. That's quite amusing that they managed to kind of sort of commandeer the police chief's car, and he just has to go along with them. The sort of bits of the state kind of having to join in with the clearly now more powerful collective. Yeah, so I think perhaps part of the achievement is to not make him very clearly a hero. There are sort of resolutions to these movies, but you don't leave thinking, he's not the old Batman. It's not James Bond. It's not, this is a sort of someone who's sort of done their best in a kind of grumpy, abrasive manner, but it hasn't really sorted everything out. At the end of the first movie, I think he says, right, let's go and fire another one.
Right.
Let's
make the same mistake again, let's just do it again,
Yeah, he revolted me at the beginning. He's like this guy who he's like, 2 people died. Well, that's science for you.
Yeah. So at one point, I think Karun's wife says to him, says, we're doing this for the good of the world. And she says, you mean Quatermass's world, your world. Mm. And there is definitely that sort of myopic vision. So in that sense, he's very definitely a villain. At the same time, he's also pushing back at a kind of invasion of the body snatchers kind of homogenization. So I think he's, in that sense, is a really interesting sort of torn character. And I certainly don't, I'm not trying to sort of suggest that he's some kind of saint at all. I think he's a very dodgy individual who, through the circumstances of the movie, does some quite good things, asks some quite difficult questions of powerful people, and puts himself at some quite considerable risk at times, But I don't think he's a hero.
Just sort of bringing a couple threads together. I think another aspect of his casting as an American speaks to this question of collectivization, where you have, literally this gruff American cowboy, libertarian, doesn't bow to some queen, isn't bound by these like stuffy rules of etiquette and whatever against this British establishment of, oh, there's a protocol for doing things. And he just sort of, fires off his rocket.
Yeah. And interestingly, in Quatermass and the Pit, the characterization is pretty similar. It's different actor. It's Andrew Keir.
Right.
Andrew Keir.
Yeah, but plays it in many ways very similar. I mean, presumably that's in the script as well. But he does not come across as a sort of organization man at all. I mean, he's dressed as if he's come off sort of rambling off across the moor or something. You know, he doesn't look like a person who's sits behind a desk all day. And it's a very different. I mean, you've got a beard for one thing. I mean, that's very. I'm sure you know in 60s kind of establishment circles, unless you're in the Navy, I think that wearing a beard was probably regarded as tantamount to communism. You know, so he's definitely a slightly subversive figure.
To your hobgoblinology, Andrew Keir himself was the son of a coal miner, and he left school to work in the coal mines next to his dad. And then seeing him in a movie where you're essentially discovering the hobgoblins of society, he becomes the hobgoblin of the Quatermass hobgoblin in a sense.
He sort of does in a not particularly good way. I think this bit where there's him and another guy, and they're in the pub, and they're sort of getting affected by this Martian, whatever it is, and then have a row as to who's more different than the other one. I think the film gets into a total cul-de-sac at that point, and the riot that's going on outside is really sort of unclear. I mean, I think it's supposed to be some sort of racist riot picking on outsiders, but it's very unclear what exactly, you know. I mean, somebody gets picked on who's wearing a trilby hat. Is that what they, you know, it's like it's very difficult to know what on earth that whole sequence is really about.
It's one of those scenes from sci-fi that I feel like, yeah, this person watched Village of the Damned or Invasion of the Body Snatchers and wanted a scene that looked like that in the movie. But yeah, you're right. It feels like I kind of missed something in the narrative.
I think it's because the TV version is much more explicit.
Right.
That the Martians have somehow impregnated the human race with this sort of racism, and that's what they're confronting. And in the movie, it's like they get cold feet. They don't want to state it explicitly, and they can't. And then it just becomes a muddle. And I think that's why you end up with that awful bit of dialogue in the pub, which just kind of feels like really uncomfortable, entitled people arguing about how oppressed they are. So yeah, I think there's a big problem there. But my guess is it probably wasn't in Neil's original screenplay. My guess is that was much more explicit, and that I imagine that in the process of production, it got sort of watered down and thereby made less palatable. Interestingly, yeah. I mean, these movies were controversial. At least the sort of TV versions were definitely controversial anyway. So I think there was a certain amount of tiptoeing around stuff. Yeah, I think that's probably that is part of the that would be a failure within the film. I think, yeah, not to acknowledge that. Not the only time that's happened, you know. Part of a sad pattern, I think.
The only other thing that we watched of Nigel Neal's was the Stone tapes,
Yeah.
and Fisher talks about it in his essay, where there's a memory that is in the stone that is projected on. And that has a resonance to me with the Quatermass. Is it Quatermass in the Experiment, where they do a test on the woman and she projects the image?
That's the pit, I believe.
The pit. Okay, yeah. Okay, Quatermass in the pit. They do and there seems to be the same tie-in of like something has a memory that we can access through this mediated thing, and it goes back to your thing about the spectacle. And it seems like Nigel Neal is preoccupied by this question of memory being recorded through spaces or objects, and that has a fundamental eeriness to it. You talked about it a little bit in your book, but
Yeah, I don't really pay too much attention to it, and I'm sort of tempted to kind of really look very carefully at the Stone Tape because it's a much loved TV film or TV play, and I think there are contradictions, there are things in there are tensions in there. The most obvious one that jumped, I watched it again recently, that I never liked it. I always felt deeply uncomfortable watching it. And I think the main thing that's making me really, really uncomfortable about it is just how toxic the relationships are. I mean, it is just so horrible and uncomfortable. The treatment of the women who are working as part of this project, the sort of boys' club behavior and attitude and atmosphere, it is really deeply disturbing. And my feeling was, having watched it, is that essentially, in the same way as like the sort of the id of the workforce in Quatermass 2 jumps up into these fabulous sort of vegetable beings, that it's this horrible project and the relationships of the people in them, which is creating this nightmarish thing going on in this room. I mean, that seems to me to be what the film is kind of telling. That's the blurting out for me, and all this stuff about technology and is it in the stone or then, and then someone shouts out it's in the computer and all that stuff. No, it's in you, you bastards. It's in you, you nasty people. You're conjuring this out of you, out of in the present now. And that's my overriding feeling about it. I know it's a terribly influential movie in the sense, like Prince of Darkness and later on Halloween 3, kind of the same ideas are kind of fed in a bit by Neil Wright in the first version of the screenplay. So I know it's kind of permeated out in this idea of sort of wedding together technology and the ancient or the supernatural or whatever. That this is a powerful structural relationship, but I think much more outstanding to me are the interpersonal relationships that are going on in that organization, and I'd like, and how does that relate to the history of that place, to what we see of that, and how does that relate to whatever that strange and ancient force there is that supposedly is uncovered when everything else is stripped away, and that eventually kills the Jane Asher character. What is it that she sees that causes her to sort of plunge through time and space to her demise? I'd like to look at it again and try to get to grips with what's going on there. But it may be that what's going on there is horrible and banal in a way that a lot of the other stuff we've talked about today is not. Maybe it's because there's a focus on intergender relationships in a way that many of these other artifacts are almost entirely male.
I think you mentioned in your book that the movies strip any gendered relationships from the shows. And that to me speaks to, it ends up being nothing but a boys' club in the movies. And with the Stone Tapes, the haunting is a woman in distress from generations ago, and in the present there's a woman who's harassed constantly and put into coercive and horrible situations, and it doesn't seem like the film really reckons with the kind of violence that's inflicted on her so much, or maybe that the whole movie is about the violence inflicted on her,
but it doesn't acknowledge it. It's as if it's not happening. It's as if something else is happening, and that is purely set dressing.
Yeah.
When I first saw the movie, I was immediately just like, wait, these guys are scientists? Like, it just seemed like a frat house, the way they depicted everybody. But it is interesting in this conversation because the woman does essentially become not just the subject of research, but like a literal object in the sense that she is basically a living projector screen that they're using for their market research to develop this, apparently they want to turn this ancient spooky castle into a storage medium, which
Yeah.
I find a funny like requiem for like British economic and technological influence that at the same time this movie came out about this like essentially startup company trying to turn rocks into a storage medium. In real life, the Japanese were developing the CD.
Yeah.
Like, as this was all happening in real life, someone else was actually making the revolutionary storage medium.
Yeah.
And in the Quatermass in the Pit, to bring it back, one of the characters becomes that living projector screen.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
Quatermass just punches.
Yes.
Like, just brutally.
Yeah.
For no real discernible reason. But
I mean, that's probably one I would like to go and have a look at the stone tape and some of its resonances, because the Barbara Shelley character in Quatermass in the Pit in some ways is very similar to the Jane Asher character.
Yeah.
But they're treated very differently by the people around them until that moment, right at the end, very close to the end, where Quatermass's kind of version of the slap across the face, pull yourself together, is a sort of full-blown haymaker. There's a buried gender violence that's explicit in that moment, and it is explicit throughout the stone tape, that it might be worth sort of going back and having a look at some of the other stuff to address that, really. I mean, as I say, I'm a little uncomfortable with Nigel Neal's kind of conservative response to the kind of personal liberation elements of the 60s and early 70s. I probably need to look at his Sex Olympics play. I think I saw it on telly when it first came out, but I've got very little recollection of it. But I think I probably need to go and have another look at that. And there's a whole other element in these movies that needs to be addressed. There's a wonderful book by Ann Bilson. It's part of the BFI series in which she addresses the John Carpenter movie, The Thing. And John Carpenter, obviously a big Nigel Neal fan. And in the book, Ann Bilson, very brilliantly, I think, writes about this. Again, it's another boys' club. It's another sort of frat house grouping of people posing as scientists, but often behaving in a college way. And she makes a strong argument, I think, that essentially the monster takes on a kind of female identity. And is that going on in Nigel Neal? Is he kind of writing the women out of the story, but they're somehow coming back in unintentionally? But I don't know. I haven't thought about that until now we're having this conversation and it's coming out. But I'm wondering whether, looking at that work again through the lens of Ann Bilson's fantastic analysis of The Thing, I'm wondering whether a whole other set of observations are possible on this material. But maybe I'm not the person to do that. That's maybe somebody else is going to be much better at that than me.
Well, thank you for coming and talking to us. I really enjoyed this discussion. I mean,
2 hours went by like 20 minutes.
Yeah. I was a bit shocked when I looked down at the clock.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
I really enjoyed reading the book. Go check it out if you want to plug the book or anything else you've been working on.
The Albion's Eco-Eerie, so it covers all the stuff we talked about and quite a lot more. And it's on the Temporal Boundary Press website. So if you Google, or other facilities are available, Temporal Boundary Press, it's available there.
Yep. Thank you again. And
thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marlo. Thank you, Stephen. It's been a real pleasure to immerse for a couple of hours in stuff that I really have enjoyed for a long time, and also to end up with a really troubling kind of thing coming up. But troubling things are good, I think, and we need to be troubled. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
All right then. Bye.
All right.
industrial revolution, a serious decision for the Hobgoblin.